Greetings to you. This is Helen Thomas from the CDFM study group. And welcome back. So we took a couple weeks off to allow individuals who just completed the review of Module 3 an opportunity to go ahead and get tested within that 2-week period. So this is our 2-week break we're coming off of so that we can begin CDFM Module 2 today. So the order in which I recommend you do the CDFM is Module 1, Module 3, and then Module 2. And the reason Module 2 is placed at the end is because the majority of the information that is covered in Module 1 and 3, you will also find in Module 2, because the information overlaps. So it's important for you to review all 3 modules. So welcome to those who are on the phone line. Would you like to say anything? Good morning. This is Helen Thomas. Who am I speaking to? All right. You might just be here to just listen, so you don't have to say anything. You could just listen to the review this morning. All right, so let's see. So we're starting Module 2.1 today, which is the defense budget process. I have scheduled for next week to continue review of that same section because there's a lot of information to cover in Module 2.1. So 3 May and 10 May is dedicated to the defense budget process. Then let's see, then the 17th and the 24th of May will go over Module 2, Competency 2, Cost and Economic Analysis. That's another big area that you have to cover. I will tell you from my experience of doing this and helping people to study for the past, I don't know, since 2011, I think I've been doing this, is Module 2 seems to be the most difficult for people. And it's not because you cannot learn the information, it's because there's a lot of it. So you have to grasp the same concept, understanding the key principles, definitions, key personnel, documents involved in the process. And you got to know what process are they involved in. If I just throw words at you in a puzzle, can you then take those words and put them in the right category? So Module 2 kind of forces people to study a little bit more for comprehension. Do not study the CDFM thinking you're just going to memorize what's in the book. It's going to be very difficult for you to be successful on the exam. The exams, it's a certification, so it's based off of what you understand of that concept or that process or whatever the topic is being discussed. And then Module 2.3, Strategic Planning and Organizational Performance Management, which accounts for 17%, will be done on 31 May. Fiscal Law, we'll go over that again on 7 June, because again, Fiscal Law accounts for the majority of the questions, regardless of which module you are studying for. So for Module 2, let me get my glasses. Fiscal Law accounts for 34.9%. So let me go back over. So the one we're going over today accounts for 33.6%. So that is the second. Then Fiscal Law is the highest amount of questions that will come on your Module 2 exam. So it's important. So we talk about Fiscal Law for each of the modules. And I took my the JAG course, Fiscal Law, this past week, so I was getting a better understanding of some of the concepts. So once we get there, I'll be able to kind of break down some stuff for you. Any question before we begin with CDFM Module 2, Competency 1, Defense Budget Process? All right, so the idea behind the CDFM study group is I don't charge anything. I don't give you the material. It's no different. And if you go to college and you get your study guide, we have the same class and we're studying together. That's what the study group is about. So I always recommend individuals to join the ASMC, get that professional tag behind your name, ASMC member. you want to become an ASMC member, because when you take the CDFM, you are discounted on how much it costs you to register, to become a member, and so forth. So ensure that you also order your study guides from the CDFM under ASMC, American Society of Military Comptroller. I recommend that you use all the tools available, not just mine. I'm just here to kind of point out certain areas within the study guide. I don't go page by page because that's not my job. My job here with you is to grasp some of the concepts that are difficult for some people to understand and to try to simplify so that it doesn't get overlooked as you're studying. All right, so let us begin on page 2.1.7. I'm in the 2020 study guide. So it begins with understanding that this is a DoD exam. So it's important for you to know what the DoD's mission is. So the DoD's mission to provide the forces to defend and secure our country and our allies, basically our surrounding areas. So in order for us to do all of that, to meet the defense mission, we need resources. So that's where the budget and the budget process comes into play, because you can't do your mission if you don't have any money, right? So you got to look at it like that. So the mission of the Department of Defense requires support of the military. There are 3 military departments: Army, Navy, and the Air Force. You have several defense agencies, and it says over 20 defense agencies and some other field activities. So we're going to be looking at several of these key organizations and what they do within this budget process. And we're going to tie it all together. At the bottom of page 217, it also says that we have to look at the function of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. All right, that's the people who does the legwork for the Secretary of Defense. The importance of the USD Comptroller, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. They are the Chief Financial Officer for the DoD. And we're going to look later on the functions and the roles and responsibilities of several of the key individuals in this budget process. So relationships, hierarchy. On page 219, you see the diagram of the evolution of our Department of Defense, starting with the National Security Act of 1947. So there's some laws and some regulations that comes up quite frequently in the CDFM. So it's important for you to know them. So the National Security Act of 1947 established several things. It established the National Security Council that we're going to talk about in a little bit. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. It also identified a civilian Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we're going to talk about each one of those, the functions of each major. But this is a very important law because all of these key individuals play a role in the development of the federal budget and the DoD's budget. If you also notice in that diagram on page 219, the introduction of the Space Force, that's very recent. So if you have an older study guide, older than maybe the 2018, I don't think it was, nope, it wasn't in the 2018 either, because it wasn't until December 19, 2019, you have the establishment of the Space Force, United States Space Force. So that's something important. When you're reviewing and you're studying, you want to look at the page and see what sticks out, what is different from everything else on that page. And the fact that the Space Force is something new that was enacted is something for you to know. So 2019, December 2019, established the Space Force. And we're going to look at the SecDef and all of that, guys. All right. So let's take it over. So on the diagram on page 10, 2110, at the very top, you can see the that hierarchy, starting with the Secretary of Defense, who is a civilian. Then you have Inspector General, you have the various secretariats, Deputy Secretary of Defense, you have the Army, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, the Air Force, and the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. I got to slow down so I can pronounce my word. You also have those over 20 plus defense agencies, field activities, and combatant commanders. Combatant commanders are important in the DoD function. You're going to see in a little bit, because think about the mission of the Department of Defense: provide forces that will provide safety and security of our country. So you need the combatant commanders in that process. Page 11 gives you a list of the individuals or titles of individuals that fall under the office of the Secretary of Defense. We're going to go through some of these individually, so I'm not going to go down that list. That's just something for you can read through. If the individual works at the Department of Defense level, their title is often Undersecretary of Defense for personnel or logistics or whatever it is. If it's at the Army levels, Assistant Secretary of ASA, FMMC. So make sure you know what level. So if you're taking a multiple choice test and one of the choices is which DoD Secretariat is responsible for the budgeting phase of P, you don't pick Assistant Secretary of the Army for budget or comptroller. No, you're going to pick the Undersecretary of Defense comptroller. So based on the title, you can, if in case you get brain cramp, you will remember that piece. Any questions thus far? All right, so let's go to page 12. So each of the services have a top military representative, Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Army has one, Navy has one, and so forth. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, their job is to review whatever policies, operation orders come on the table for that service. They review it, then they all provide that information to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff so that the chairman can make that final decision, that one person. And actually, let's go to the top of page 13. We'll start with the chairman. So if you read through that paragraph, you will see the law that enacted that position as the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. That one is also important. Just highlighting it. So the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act identified one representative. So think about it. So prior to this, it sounds like the Army had its own chief, Navy their own chief, and there wasn't one voice speaking for them. They actually spoke for each services. So now it's the function of the chairman to synchronize all these efforts from all the services and speak for the military with one voice. So that's the function of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So what you need to know for this section on page 2113 is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the top military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, to the President, and to the National Security Council. And it's listed in that paragraph on 13. So think about it. Your president is a civilian. Let me do this. So, all right. So your president is a civilian. Can you hear me on the, because the last time I did this, I didn't ask if anybody can hear me. So let me pause. Can you hear me, ma'am?
I can hear you.
Okay, all right. And I think I had my computer muted then, so I had to redo the whole thing. All right, so remember your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian. So your top military person in this whole process is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the chairman talks everything military and advises the Secretary of Defense, civilian, President, civilian, and the National Security Council that we're going to talk about in a little bit and what that is. So his function, the chairman's function, is extremely important to tie everything together for the services. Then every chairman often has a vice chairman. So the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has several functions within this whole process. And actually, if I was writing the study guide, I'm going to pause right here. I would have started way back here. If I was the CDFM person for a day. So what I'm going to have you do is we're on page 13, because it's easier to explain this portion on page 13 and beyond if you understand page 28. So let's go to page 2128. Let me explain that diagram, then I'll come back to 13. All right, 2128 says there's the Department of Defense uses 3 support systems to determine what resources is needed. So every mission the Department of Defense does falls into one of those 3 categories. You have JCIDS, the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. That's the diagram on the bottom left. Then the top of that diagram is the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process. That's the resourcing. And then on the right side at the bottom, that's the Defense Acquisition System. So the JCIDS determine capability gaps. Once we know what our mission is and what we want to do, now we need to identify, do we have all the resources? And if we don't, we need to identify capability gaps. So that JCIDS process is used to identify those capability gaps and determine what solution is necessary to fix the capability gap. Then the PPBE process is used to get funding, to get your programs approved, to get the budget that you need, the money that you need to actually execute that plan. If it triggers something that you need to acquire, to procure, to buy, then you may have to go to the Defense Acquisition System to do that. So everything that the Department of Defense does is either falls under one of those support systems, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. All right, so that's page 28. And I'll go into some more stuff when I come back to that page. So let's flip back to page 13. So the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, within those 3 circles, he plays several roles. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, of course, he assumes duty when the chairman's not there. That's straightforward. Acts as the chairman, holds the grade of a general. Okay. But that last bullet says that he acts as the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC. So the vice chairman who is in charge of the JCIDS process. That first system I just talked about, the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is in charge of that. The council or the board that he uses to do the JCIDS process is the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Does everyone understand that? Feels like I need to repeat it. Ms. Ivory? Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, makes sense.
Okay. So that's why I take my time with module 2, because there's so many moving pieces. All right, so chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, top military advisor to the president, the SecDef, the National Security Council. The chairman has a vice chairman, and then the vice chairman's, one of his primary functions is he is in charge of the JCIDS process. 3 DoD support system, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is in charge of the JSIDS process. The board or the council that he uses to do that analysis in JSIDS is the JRUC. So he is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. I will also tell you that later on, this same vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff sits on the defense acquisition side as a co-chairman. So they want to make sure that everything syncs together. So they have their hands in different parts of those three systems. So vice chairman is also a co-chair for the Defense Acquisition Board. That's going to come up probably when we do cost and economic analysis. And then they have the joint staff. So their roles are pretty simple. Page 14 goes into the combatant commanders, because remember, the mission of the Department of Defense is to defend our security, our country, our rights. And so we have combatant commanders that are responsible for certain regions of the globe, of the map. So on page 15, it talks about your combatant commands, NORTHCOM. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I see 11. So the 10th Unified Combatant Command, U.S. Cyber Command, the elevation. Okay, so Cyber Command is another new one. So you have 11 combatant commands. Yep, 11. Now, a key statement. Nope, I don't see it there. Is on the slide on the bottom of page 15. Operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to talk to the combatant commanders. The president does not go directly to the combatant commanders when it comes to whatever needs to be done. So anytime you hear operational chain of command runs from the president to the SecDef to the commanders of the combatant command. And on the right side, of course, don't forget your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman functions within the chain of command by transmitting the information. So the president is a civilian, Secretary of Defense is a civilian. He gives them the message. And then you have the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who's really not their commander, but he knows military to civilian. So he translates the message from the SecDef to the combatant commanders in military terms. So that's what those two slides are saying at the bottom of page 15. So now on page 16, all right. Anybody remember the law that established the National Security Council? The first law that we talked about? Is it 1947? Right? National Security Act of 1947 established the National Security Council. The CIA, the Secretary of Defense, a civilian, the Joint Chief of Staff. So page 16 talks about the National Security Council. So since defense and most of us are military minded, I'm going to kind of use the military scenarios in the sense of talking about operational orders, commanders. Most people understand that. So your National Security Council, think of the president level. He is the president of that board. He has a group of individuals that they talk about, they look at the status of the country, they determine the security threats, the priorities of our country, all of that. So the top of page 17 talks about the principal, the primary members of this National Security Council, the president, vice president, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, and the Secretary of the Treasury. It's important for you to know who are the primary members of the NSC, National Security Council, and then you have two advisors. We already talked about the chairman being the military advisor, and then you have your intelligence, Director of National Intelligence. Your intel guy is also an advisor. So we don't get our policies from the advisors. or policies come from the Secretary of Defense. So think of your higher command. That is your National Security Council, and you fall under that higher command. So that's going to come into play later once we talk about page 18. So your higher command, once they do their analysis of the country, of the nation, of priorities of what they're trying to do with the country, then they publish the National Security Strategy. That's saying what the focus is going to be, what our priorities are for the next coming years. So on page 18, the document that is created as a result of the National Security Council is the National Security Strategy. Look at that document as your big op order. What do we do with an operation order? When you get an operation order from your higher, you take it in and you skim through it looking for, okay, what they want me to do? What do they want me to do? So you're looking at what the mission is, then you're going to kind of find out. So Department of Defense gives us this big op order as the National Security Council, the National Security Strategy from the National Security Council. Then the Department of Defense needs to take this and determine what are the defense-related strategy, mission, things that we have to do. So on the bottom of page 18 in that paragraph, it talks about every organization, every agency must produce their strategy. So the National Defense Strategy is the DoD's report, which is done every 4 years. So they take the big op order, National Security Strategy, where all the agencies get a copy of the big op order. Then the Department of Defense takes that big op order and they determine what's defense-related things, and they publish the National Defense Strategy every 4 years. And it says it's tied into, let's see, the 4-year review is due January of the second year of a president's term. And that way, when it's time to get a new president, they have a year before they actually have to do another strategy. So they have a year in the job before they have to do it. So the National Defense Strategy is published the second year of a presidential term. Any question thus far? All right, so we started with the big op order, National Security Strategy. We're at the National Defense Strategy because we get all our guidance from the Secretary of Defense. On page 19, they also introduced the National Military Strategy. And then what's important here is for you to understand, if they say who writes it, who develops it, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff develops it. And all of this is packaged with that National Defense Strategy. So the National Military Strategy is developed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. It's looking at what are the military specific targets, strategy, things that the military has to do to meet the big op order of the National Security Strategy. So that's important. So who writes the National Military Strategy? The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Who publishes the National Defense Strategy? That's why you got to know the words. That's what I'm emphasizing. Is the Secretary of Defense is the author. You also have the Strategy for Homeland Defense and Civil Support. That one is prepared by the Secretary of Defense. So when you're thinking about what's different, the only difference is the National Military Strategy by the chairman. So we have JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. The chairman of the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council, is responsible for the JCIDS process. Page 20 touches on the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, the P process overview. That's where you tie in the strategy. Now you got to take the strategy that you just developed and you need to translate it into, okay, the programs you need to do their mission and the money that you need to get the mission done. So that's what the PPBE process does for this. So it says one of the primary tools for resource management is PEEP. It articulates the strategy, taking that detailed strategy, and now you're placing it in a format where you can actually request resourcing. Okay, so it looks like I said all of that. All right, so what we're going to look at for the next few, starting on page 21, let's see, key officials in the PPBE process. So if you look and kind of read through these, you'll see I already talked about the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chief of Staff, the combatant commanders. If you look at the paragraph on page 2122, both the Joint Chief of Staff and combatant commanders play a major role. In the middle of that, you'll see the introduction of a term, integrated priority list. So none of your key player are those combatant commanders. Whenever they have resources for those regions that they're responsible for, they publish or they submit an integrated priority list. You're going to see it again in a little bit, so I'm not going to focus much on it here. Yeah. All right. Page 23. So as mentioned, the Chief Financial Officer for the Secretary of Defense is the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, USD Comptroller. That's the CFO. So you can kind of look at all the functions of the CFO. But what I want to point out, in the PPBE process, the USD Comptroller is responsible for the budgeting and the execution phase of PPBE. I repeat, you can see all the functions of the USD Comptroller on page 23, 2123. But what I want to point out is think of the three systems, JCIDS, PPBE, Defense Acquisition System. I'm always repeating because that's how you're going to remember. So I'd advise you to do the same thing. JCIDS, there's oversight is done by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who has the JROC. And then the PPBE, you got plan, program, budget, and execution. Again, I would have done the study guide in a different order because I would have put the person in charge of planning first. But again, we got to go with what we have. So page 23, budget and execution is done by the USD Comptroller. Page 24, that first bullet tells you that the USD for policy, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is in charge of the planning phase of PEEP. So I would have put this one first. So planning is the USD for Policy. Program, we're going to look at in a little bit. So I don't want to say it yet. That one is way back there. All right, on page 25, if you want to slow me down at any time and ask questions, please feel free to do so. All right, so page 25 talks about the USD Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. Now, if you have an older study guide, yours probably say USD AT&L, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. That is the old term. So the new term is Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisition and Sustainment. So they're responsible for advising the SecDef on all logistics and acquisition related functions. All right, so who's in charge of the planning phase of PEEP? Anybody can answer? All right, the USD for policy. We hadn't said programming yet, and we got budget and execution is the USD Comptroller. So page 25, when they talk about acquisition and sustainment, this is the individual that's in charge of the third system, resource system, which is a defense acquisition system. So this one is important. So you already know JCIDS, defense acquisition system, planning, budget execution. So the only thing we're missing right now is who's in charge of programming. Page 26 gives you another individual, which I think is different from the older study guide. This is your Chief Technology Officer is now called the Undersecretary of Defense Research and Engineering. And the older study guide, I know it doesn't say that. It probably says, what is it, CIO or something like that. So make sure you understand. So they're in charge of the technology stuff or functions, research and engineering. Page 27, another important individual in this budget process is the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE. Your cost person is the one that's in charge of the programming phase of P. So they provide the programming guidance. If you look on page 27, you got DOD, they prepare and publish fiscal guidance, DOD's programming guidance, programmatic decision documents, and the future years defense program. Let me see how far back that is before I talk about it, because we're going to go through some of these again. That one's too far back there. So the future year defense program, it comes up about 4 or 5 pages in the front. That is the DOD database that keeps track of all the resources necessary. Because again, if you're a cost person, cost analysis person, they want to know what things cost. So they use this database to keep track of all those resources. And we'll talk about it more in detail when I get to it. At the bottom of page 27, and I think this is the only spot where I saw this, is the Defense Acquisition Board. So every system, they have a board, because the person in charge of it, just think about it logically, is not the one doing all the analysis and the work. They just has a title, so they get credit for it. So under Defense Acquisition System, the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment, he has the Defense Acquisition Board that is used to help determine costs and whatever they need to acquire in the acquisition system. So as it states on page 27, kind of feels that this is out of place and it should have been with the USD A&S, but again, I didn't write the book. So chaired by the USD A&S, Acquisition and Sustainment, this board oversees development and production of major weapon systems, and it represents a link between PEB and the acquisition. So they're trying to tie, when we get to the diagram on the next page, let's go to page 27, you'll see how those 3 systems overlap. And in the middle of it, you see the National Defense Strategy, because they all overlap to work together to meet the National Defense Strategy, and the National Defense Strategy meets the bigger op order, which is the National Security Strategy. So let me explain now, it's not in the book, let me explain what's going on in the JCITS process. So once the National Defense Strategy is published, then the JCITS process begins. During the JCITS process, what the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the JROC Council is doing is, I don't know if you've ever heard this acronym, MLPF, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leader Development / Education, Personnel, and Facilities. If you've ever worked with TRADOC, you're quite familiar with this. So the JCITS process, they're analyzing the doctrine. Is there something we need to change in the doctrine? No. Is it an organizational structure problem? What's the capability gap? They have to identify it. So they use this .MLPF process to do that, to identify the gap. If the gap is anything other than material, then it triggers the PPBE process. Okay, we just need more resources. We need more programs. We need more money. Or if it's a material solution gonna fix that problem, then it triggers the acquisition system. So I just kind of want to throw that together. That's a simplified way of explaining how the systems work. So I always start, when I recommend people study, start with JCITS, because it helps you to identify the capability gap, and based on what type of solution is going to take, to fix the problem will determine whether you move on to the PPBE process to get Congress to approve the money or the programs, or you got to go to the Defense Acquisition System process. Any questions thus far? So on the diagram on page 29, it kind of shows you the PPBE process and how things overlap. There's always in a planning phase here, programming, so they continuously overlap. And so if you see it again, it may be like a chart, and it might say if it's FY20, if it's FY20 and it's May, what's going on? And you have to look at the calendar that they provide and then tell them exactly what's going on during that time. So that's kind of what this is. So this diagram, if I could try it, I'm gonna try to orient you to it. At the top left, it starts with the president, then the National Security Council, he's in charge of that. Then the National Security Council publishes the National Security Strategy and sends them out to all the agencies. Department of Defense, being an agency, takes the big op order and then develops the National Defense Strategy. He sends out this National Defense Strategy, but before he does that, it goes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff need to come up with what the military requirements are going to be to meet this National Defense Strategy. So in the middle, on the left side, you see the NDS, then it goes down to the Joint Chief of Staff, and then who creates the National Military Strategy? That is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And then if you look under the NMS, you see the IPLs, Integrated Priority List. That's your combatant commanders saying, okay, this is what we're expected to do. These are the resources we're going to need to do it. So the IPL is sent to different levels so that everyone knows what those combatant commanders need. So the joint planning guidance, we need to know JPD is planning, because we got to make a planning decision. So defense planning guidance. So before the phase begins in the PPBE process, you got to have guidance. What are we going to do? So DPG is the end result that we get no later than May. Then once we get the planning guidance, we go through the planning phases. Then we start developing the POM, Program Objective Memorandum, and the budget. The best, you do that budget estimate submission at the same time. And as you can see the diagram in the middle, PDM, POM, and budget development goes up to the USD Comptroller, because again, they're in charge of budget and execution. So the USD Comptroller will give guidance on the budget development so that we can develop our best BS, budget estimate submission. But oh, by the way, August, if you look down August, don't forget your Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, your DCAPE. That's the person that's in charge of all the cost analysis. They're in charge of the future year defense program and also in charge of the programming phase of PEEB. So you submit your POM, and based on what is submitted, you have issue books. That's again what they identify once they review the POM. Then the program decision memorandum comes out of that program budget decision. So we're going to look at each one of those. So I just kind of want to orient you to the issue resolution, to where we get to where the president submits the budget to Congress. That's what all of this is talking about. And we're going to go through individually now. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff, once I get to it now, you're going to see it's all a repeat. So I won't linger on it too long. So starting on page 30, they talk again about the defense strategy, National Defense Strategy. So big op order, NSS, National Security Strategy, comes from the National Security Council, who the president is in charge of. The primary members, presidents, vice presidents, SecDef, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of State, Secretary of, I forgot one. What's the last one? Treasury. We need money, right? So Treasury. And so the defense strategy comes out of that. Defense planning guidance is then telling us before we go into the PPBE process, these are our guidance. So on page 31 is the planning phase of PEEB. So I'm not going to repeat all that other than asking who's in charge of the planning phase of PEEB. All right, I hear crickets. All right, so you have, go ahead.
Oh, under Secretary of Defense for Policy.
For policy, correct. So the USD for policy, so that's what you're gonna have to do because the information doesn't kind of flow the way even I would like it when I study. So you have to be able to jumble it all together. So planning phase of PEEB is a responsibility of the USD for policy. The final document that is published at the end of the planning phase of PEEB or the planning phase of PEEB is the defense planning guidance at the bottom of page 31. That's the final document of the planning phase. So that's important. So each of the phase has a final document. Planning, DPG, Defense Planning Guidance. On page 32, what they're just talking about more of where the information comes for the planning process. Talks about the national defense strategy, the national military strategy. I'm looking at the bullets. Talks about the combatant commanders' input that they provide. What is the document that the combatant commanders submit to get their input in the process? And it's the only document created by the combatant commanders. And you'll see it again. That's the Integrated Priority List, IPLs. So a lot of these is repeat. Yep, we went over that. On the right side, the joint strategic planning, joint staff, we talked about that. The chairman giving his guidance and advice. And under Joint Chiefs of Staff and Combatant Commanders in bold, you see it again. So this is like the third time you've seen it. So the primary interaction between the combatant commanders and the military department is through the component commanders. Combatant commanders, so we got some exception to policy here. That's what those bolds mean. Combatant commanders, with the exception of Special Operations Command, SOCOM, do not submit a POM or BEST directly to OSD. So everybody else, they got to go through the military department that's responsible for what they want or what they need. Let me put it that way. I repeat, exception to the policy for the normal process. The normal process is combatant commanders will send their IPLs to the military department, to the chairman, to the SecDef, so everybody knows, but the responsibility to include it in their POM, to include it in their budget submission is the responsibility of the military department responsible for that function. However, SOCOM is, they do their own stuff. They do it, they submit their own directly. So that's what it's saying in page, the second to last paragraph on page 33. So IPL again comes from the combatant commanders. And on page 34, there it is. That's as much as you're going to get on it again. Integrated priority list. That is the document that each combatant commander prepares to identify their high priority needs. Based on what the mission is given to them, they have to identify what capability gaps they have. What do they need? So their need is submitted on an integrated priority list. So to recap, before we go to the programming phase on page 35, the final document in the planning phase of PEEB is the defense planning guidance. The second phase of PEEB, the programming phase. Who's in charge of the programming phase? Because it doesn't say it again on the page, so you would have had to have remembered from the beginning. So I'm gonna write it on my book. That's your DK. Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation is in charge of programming. Let me see. They're in charge of the Future Year Defense Program, and I think some other stuff. Analysis of the alternative, you'll find out in cost and economic analysis. But for now, programming phase, even if you don't remember nothing else on this page, the DK, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. And it's in right there in his title, 2135. So on page 36, the end result of the programming phase is the POM, right? Program Objective Memorandum. The DoD components develop proposed programs. So whatever programs we want, because in order for us to meet our strategy, we have certain category of things that we need to get done. Those are our programs. We got to get approval for the programs. Then we got to also request funding for those programs. On page 37 is, I think this is all it's going to say about the Future Year Defense Program. And the diagram is on the next page. So Future Year Defense Program, the DK has to keep track of the DoD's primary mission, major force program, all the resources, the type of appropriation needed, which services uses that appropriation to meet that mission. That is kept in the Future Year Defense Program. And FYDP contains, you make sure you read over those two bullets under that, because I do get a lot of people come back and say, hey, they kind of ask me how many years is in the Future Year Defense Program. So make sure you read that portion. And so the FYDP is usually updated during this whole POM process. When we're doing the POM and the BEST, you're updating the data at that point. And the president's budget, after the president submits the budget to Congress, no later than the first Monday in February for the upcoming fiscal year, and the department has finalized the Future Year Defense Program database, the database becomes the starting point or your baseline. So the FYDP is important. Who's in charge of FYDP? Your DK, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So on page 38, I'm more of a visual person, so I like to focus on these diagrams. So as you can see on the diagram on the top of page 38, it shows you the Future Year Defense Program. I think in the study guide, this is the only time where I saw the word database. So that might be a little trigger word to help you remember. You have 12 major force programs. That means every function the Department of Defense conducts falls under one or 12 of those. Any one of those 12. At the top, you see the various appropriations. They're not directly aligned to any particular force program. It's just saying these are the major appropriations that can be used by any one of these components. 11 major force programs. They have resources that they need to meet, and under each one of those, you have various appropriations. Those are your major appropriations, and then the different services or components can use that particular appropriation. So that's your FYDP. Then you have several decision-making forums. So that's more of a list of things, 3-star deputy management groups. So whenever you send your POMs, whenever you send your budget requests, they go through several stages of review. So what these guys are reviewing. Page 41, let me see, outline proposed. Actually, page 40 is telling you that, of course, no matter what you send up, somebody's going to find issues. So those issues are usually published in what's called an issue book. Because again, once you have the body of people do the review, they got to put their recommendation based on the issues they identify in that request. So programmatic issues, programmatic review to identify those issues. And don't forget about your chairman. because even though he's not in the direct chain of command, he's still involved in this process. So on page 41, you have the chairman's program assessment, because he's reviewing whatever program you submit in your POM. You have your chairman's going to provide their recommendation to the Secretary of Defense advisor. So the Joint Staff conducts a review of the POMs at the same time the OSD staff is conducting its review. So it focuses on balance and capabilities of the forces. So CPA, Chairman's Program Assessment. Then your final document in the programming phase is the Program Decision Memorandum. So the final document of the planning was Defense Planning Guidance. Final document in the programming phase is the Program Decision Memorandum. So program is in the word, final document. So that completes the programming phase. Then on page 42, it goes into the budgeting phase of P. And we already mentioned that the USD comptroller is in charge of the budgeting phase of PPBE. So that's where now we translate those programs and what we want to do into appropriation funding. So we need to be able to translate it to ask for the money for the particular programs that we want to accomplish. So 2143 mentions the budget estimate submission, the best. Each DoD components, that's whenever you submit a POM and you submit a BEST, budget estimate submission. It's submitted to OSD no later than the due date that's specified. In the beginning, you already know when it needs to be submitted. Got some timelines at the bottom. Usually the budgeting side and the programming side happens at the same time. So they're similar but different. And we're going to look at the different because they go through different channels and different scrutiny. 2144. So once your budget is submitted to OSD, Office of the Secretary of Defense, USD Comptroller, submitted to hire. But don't forget your highest resource manager is Office of Management and Budget. So the DoD has to submit their budget to OMB for inclusion into the president's budget. So when the OSD and the OMB sits down to go over their budget estimate, that is called the fall review. Once a decision is made by OMB on page 44, for that fall review, whatever that final budget they're going to give to the president or submit to the president will be published in a program budget decision. So unfortunately, both of these words starts with program, so don't get confused. You got the program decision memorandum and you got the program budget decision. So let's see if I can do it now. Okay. Planning, defense planning guidance, programming, program decision memorandum, and the budgeting phase is program budget decision. So you have a budget decision and a memorandum. Still in the budgeting phase on page 2145, you have an automated system. It doesn't say database. It says automated comptroller information system. So whenever the final decision is made on the fall review with the program budget decision, those numbers are then placed in the CIS, automated system, CIS. So in the programming phase, we had the future year defense program, and they probably had dollar amounts in there too, but we don't focus on that so much. We just focus on the types of appropriation. But in the budgeting side, you're also going to update the automated CIS, Comptroller Information System. Page 46 at the top, let's see. Products of long-range planning. Okay, it's just talking about the relationship between the PPBE process and the acquisition process and how they overlap during this process. On page 2146, actually, hold on. Yeah. I know this book always throws me. It doesn't flow properly. Acquisition interrelated. So this is talking about the defense acquisition system. And as I mentioned, every system has a board or forum that meet to discuss whether you're talking JCIDS with JROC. So on the acquisition side, you have the Defense Acquisition Board. And here you go. So this is the USD ANS acquisition and sustainment, as I mentioned in previous pages, is in charge of the Defense Acquisition Board. Also, the second paragraph, the Defense Acquisition Board and the JROC help link the acquisition process to planning. You're linking everything together on the PEEP side. So the USD ANS serves as the key advisor. We already know that. And what I want you to know is the last paragraph. USD ANS, Acquisition and Sustainment, is the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff serve as the vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. So remember when I talked about the vice chairman earlier, I mentioned he's in charge of JROC, he's in charge of the JCIDS process, and he's also the vice chairman or co-chair of the Defense Acquisition Board. So that's what they're saying here again in this last paragraph. Do I need to clarify that anymore? Okay, I hear nothing. All right. Joint. So 47 kind of goes back again to JCIDS because now they're going to tell you a little bit more about the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is in charge of it. This is the council that sits down and do that analytical review of that whole JCIDS process by looking at what the strategy is, looking at our current capabilities, and identify capability gaps so that they can then come up, and when they identify the capability and the gaps, that initial page 47, the JROC validates an identified mission need, assigns a joint potential designator, how we gonna fix it, and forwards a document, ICD, initial capabilities document, with their recommendation to the USD ANS. So JROC again works with the acquisition side. So once they look at the .MLPF, doctrine, organization, material, or so forth, whatever it is, they identify the issue, then they also have to come up with a solution. The solution and the issue is provided on an initial capabilities document. This is what it's going to take to fix the problem, to fill that gap. And they submit their recommendation to the USD ANS. So ICD is important there. So I think once I walk through all these key individuals, then I'm gonna stop and pick up next week because this is enough to kind of like get your mind together here. All right, page 48, key documents. So we talk about integrated priority list. Who produces the integrated priority list? I'm gonna go down this list. That's your combatant commanders. They write the IPLs. That's how they tell their higher what needs they have. So combatant commanders. Defense planning guidance. That is the final document in the planning phase of PEEP. Who's in charge of planning? The USD for policy. Okay, that's what you know about that. POM, which is programming phase. The programming phase is responsibility of the DCAPE. Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation is also in charge of translating the information in the Future Year Defense Program and providing cost assessment and cost analysis support to the Secretary of Defense. So we take our plan, then we got to put it into program categories in the POM. Then once they review the POM, if they identify whoever's reviewing the POM, then they identify issues, they publish it in an issue book, which is like that little one pager that says what's wrong. So that one page narrative that explains what they identify as an issue, because Secretary of Defense don't have time to read all of it, right? Issue books. Program decision memorandum, that's the end of the programming phase. That is the final decision document published by the Secretary of Defense at the end of the programming phase. In the older study guides, and they put it in here, so that means it's a possibility you could see it again. In the older study guide, the final document for programming and budgeting was called the Resource Management Decision, the RMDs. So since they have it in here, that means you may see it again. So RMD for both programming and budgeting was the term used, but now you have program decision memorandum, program budget decision. The budget decision is the final document produced in the budgeting phase of PPBE. Future Year Defense Program, on the programming side, the DCAPE updates it for a total of 10 years of data. Comptroller Information System, in the budgeting phase of PEB, the Comptroller Information System is the automated system that updates with your estimates. And finally, the PresBud, President's Budget. All the agencies submit their budget estimate to Office of Management and Budget. They conduct a fall review. At the end of the fall review, when that program budget decision is made, it's submitted to the president for the president to send to Congress. So on page 49, talks about the PresBud. Based on, now they give you the law associated with that no later than the first Monday in February. The 1974 Congressional Budget Act is what requires the president to submit the budget no later than the first Monday in February of the upcoming fiscal year, for the upcoming fiscal year. So the execution phase, who's in charge of the execution phase of PPBE? I will also tell you it's primarily the USD Comptroller, because they're in charge of the budget, and the DCAPE, because the DCAPE is in charge of the programming phase. So they play a primary role in the execution part once their program and budget is approved. On page 50, once the president submits the budget to, all right, let me do this, A, B, and C. So once the president submits their budget to Congress, now Congress has several actions that it takes on it. Really, there's three major phases. The budget resolution process at the bottom. So Congress have to determine what guidelines they're going to use for that particular year to review the president's budget. So in the concurrent, telling you it's happening on both the House and the Senate side, is the Congressional Budget Office will provide the numbers. Think of an accountant going to tell you where you're starting from, what's the deficit, what's our revenue, how much money did we take in, what's our 5-year execution plan or whatever. All of that data is provided in the concurrent budget resolution so that the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee can determine the restrictions or guidelines they're going to use or controls. At the top of page 51, the second phase is also happening at the same time, the authorization process. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee in Congress is responsible for the authorization process. The authorization process approves programs. Remember, we said programming, budgeting. So The POM process ends up going to the authorizers. They authorize the programs for that fiscal year. Even if funding is listed in the authorization law, because it goes to the president for the president to sign, it becomes law, we do not have budget authority until you get the appropriation, which is the third phase. So the House and Senate Appropriation Committee is responsible for the appropriations process. So you have 12 appropriations. Once the appropriation process concludes, understand that the House and the Senate must come together to resolve differences. Whenever the House and Senate comes together to resolve their differences, it's called a conference committee or the third chamber. We covered this in module 1 and 3 in some instances. So it's all packaged differently, but it's the same information. And so once they resolve their differences, they go back to their floor. It doesn't matter how many people we bring to the conference. We're speaking as one voice because only one document can get enrolled, submit to the president for the president to sign. So Congress appropriates the money. Once the appropriation occurs, two things happen. Not on the page, I'm recapping. Two things happen. You have the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant, because this is tied to law. The law says we cannot get any money out the Treasury. That's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, unless we have an appropriation law in place. And so the enactment of the appropriation law notifies the Treasury notifies the agencies that their funding is available for them to start spending. The second thing that happens is OMB begins the apportionment process. So I'm tying together what we already know from module 1 and 3. So the next few pages is, let me see where I'm going to stop today. I think this is a good spot right here. All right, so the appropriations, you got MILPERS, which is an expense type, operations and maintenance, expense, because those are 1-year appropriations. You have RDT&E, which are 2-year appropriations. They are both an expense or investment, depending on what you're doing. Procurement and military construction are both investment type. So I think I want to stop here for today, because I wanted to stop where we cover all the key individuals involved in the process. And I think this is a good, let me mark my spot here. We'll pick up on appropriation categories next week. All right, so I know we covered a lot today. That's why I say I leave module 2 for the very end, because most people are not familiar with some of these terms. And so it becomes confusing unless we take our time. Make sure that you go over this information several times so that you're able to grasp it, understand it. If you got to take a whiteboard like the one behind me and kind of separate things during the different phases, draw those 3 circles, 3 DoD support system, show how they overlap, who's in charge of JCIDS, the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who also is the chairman of the JROC. And he's also a vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board in the Defense Acquisition System. So mentally, I'm visualizing those 3 circles. And then you have the PPBE process, which also overlaps to meet that defense strategy. Planning in charge is responsibility of the USD for policy, programming the DCAPE, budget and execution. Budgeting is the USD comptroller, execution is the DCAPE and the USD comptroller, because DCAPE responsible for programs and the USD comptroller is in charge of the budget. All right, so that is a good stopping point for us today. I will pause for a couple minutes to see, do we have any questions? Anything I need to clarify from what we discussed today? If not, I don't hear any questions being asked. Please make sure that you review the material again. I know I will have some time next week to kind of recap, to get us back to where we are today, but I will pick up on page 2153 when we meet again next week. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Be sure to stop by and see us on our YouTube page. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. It brings more visibility. Leave a comment on the slide if it's something you need me to clarify, or hey, give me a like, thumbs up, everything looks good, whatever it is. The more activity that shows up on the channel allows the YouTube folks to advertise that channel more. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time.